So, yeah, with the shameless plug out of the way, let's get to it, starting with the first elephant in the room, because there's actually two for this tournament, and that, of course, is the scheduling of the BWF World Tour. So yes, the scheduling of the BWF World Tour, it's been something that's been an issue, especially in recent years, especially since kind of, well, I wouldn't say necessarily since the World Tour began, because that, obviously, the World Tour started in 2018. It's been, I would say, since lockdown came out. Obviously, if you all remember back, all you badminton fans, when tournaments started to come back kind of semi-regularly after the Tokyo Olympics in the summer of 2021, there was that period from the Olympics up to Christmas that was just absolutely mental. You had like the Sudirman Cup, Thomas Cup, you had a number of other events in Europe, then you had like the Bali bubble, then you had the World Tour finals, then you even finished the year with the World Championships. It was a really crazy schedule that left a number of players obviously fatigued, exhausted, and unfortunately we also saw some injuries from that. And I think since then the scheduling has got a little bit busier, and it's something that players talk about, but fans do obviously always bring up. And I think it more around, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong with this one, but maybe it's not so much around the overall number of tournaments. I guess that it kind of go hand in hand, but it's more where certain tournaments are placed. I know I've definitely had issue with this, where sometimes you have like a Super 1000, which is supposed to be like the biggest events of the year, and sometimes they can either be right at the start of like 3 or 4 weeks of competition, or in the middle, or sometimes even at the end. And it just feels like if the Super 1000s, I know we haven't had any of those in this European leg, but still, if they're supposed to be the top tier of tournaments, then obviously you've got to be mindful of the tournaments around it, because obviously you also want those to be well attended, you want those to be of a good level. And obviously if players are playing, say, 3 or 4 weeks consecutively, then things can get a little bit tough. I think also part of the scheduling is sometimes the order of the tournaments. I know that's definitely been an issue with the tournaments in January. I think it's the Malaysia Open, the Indonesia Masters, and the India Open. I think there's too much back and forth. It would make more sense for players to be able to travel kind of in order, whereas I think at that start you go to Malaysia, then you go to India, then you come back to Indonesia. It kind of makes no sense. It's a lot of travel. Obviously with this European leg, it's 4 weeks back to back, which is incredibly tough, but at least the travel time is short. I mean, Finland to Denmark is literally next door. Denmark to France is also very short. And then obviously Germany is just a little hop over. There really isn't too much travel time around these things. But that doesn't get away from the fact that obviously 4 consecutive weeks of Super 500 and above is a little bit too much. The big question I already mentioned that we didn't see many of the top players playing the Hilo Open. Now that's historically always been the case because it's been a Super 300. It usually does follow from the Denmark Open and the French Open, which are the 2 key tournaments within this kind of autumn, October kind of European leg. But obviously being a 500, you're expecting maybe a slightly higher level. It was a little bit low. And maybe that is something to do with the scheduling, because if it's the 4th tournament in a row, not many of the top players are going to play all of that. They might have played the Arctic. We did see a bit better attended. If we compare those 2 tournaments, the Arctic was better attended, and I think that's because some players might have felt they wanted a week of competition before the 750s. The 750s came the week after. Whether that's because they're traveling for Asia, they want to kind of get used to the different climate. Obviously, the time zone changes. They want a bit of competition under their belt before they go into, obviously, the bigger tournaments. Obviously, after the fact, that's not so much of an issue. That's why, again, we haven't seen any of the China team, Korean team, or I don't think any of the Japanese team. Maybe we saw like more the independent, like Nishimoto might have played, but not many of the top, like the national team players for Japan playing the Hilo Open. And even from Indonesia, we saw that was probably the top team that entered, obviously Denmark as well. But again, we didn't see all of them. So even from Denmark, we didn't see Antonsen or Victor Axelsen play. What I'm trying to get at, I guess, is the question I initially have, and I've been thinking about this all week, is does this cheapen the Super 500 level? Because it's always spoken about that the Super 500 is the equivalent to a Super Series. And the Super Series, if you can remember, before the World Tour, it was the Super Series era. The Super Series, and then you had Super Series Premier, they were like the top tier tournaments. I know there weren't as many, well, I guess there were as many levels, but it wasn't as under the same banner. But anyway, Super Series was, if you won one, it was a huge deal. To win a Super Series tournament was massive. And then does having an equivalent tournament of the high-low, again, I'm not trying to take away from players that won in high-low or that did well that usually we wouldn't see at this tournament, but does that take away a little bit from that? So that was kind of my initial thoughts, and I was thinking about this more and more throughout the week. But then I kind of was thinking about it from this point of view, is that maybe, although they are the equivalent, we always hear Jill Clark say the Super 500 is the equivalent of the Super Series, but maybe we should kind of, I know they're the same tournament, so like if you go back in history, a Super 500, most of them were, obviously the high-low wasn't, but most of them were Super Series. But now we've got, obviously 750 and 1000s, we've got 2 levels above the Super 500, whereas in the Super Series, there was only 1 level above, and that was Super Series Premier, and there are only a handful of those. And those are the tournaments that are now your Super 1000s. So if you think of it through that way, maybe the 750s are you're basically equivalent to your Super Series, and you obviously 1000s are the Super Series Premiers. That does mean overall there's slightly less, but maybe if we look at the 500s through a slightly lower light, looking at them as a Grand Prix Gold, maybe you could blur them. So Grand Prix Gold / Super Series, then I guess maybe it doesn't necessarily cheapen the Super 500 in that way. You'd also got to look at it that having more tournaments does offer more opportunities for, say, the players that we did see at this high-low open do it better, getting to the semis, getting to the final, even winning the tournament, that wouldn't really do that well or win those kind of tournaments or get to the semis of, say, I guess you call a better attended or a usually attended 500, or obviously the Super 750s and the Super 1000s. So obviously you're going to give those players more opportunities, because I know that's been a bit of a problem. I've spoken to a few players within the singles sphere that are in that kind of, they're not quite high enough rank to get into, say, a Super 1000 or a 750 because there's no qualifying for them. But they are capable of kind of competing with some of the lower level ones. So maybe having more tournaments of a Super 500 where they can get in, they can do well, offers them more opportunities to rise through the rankings and maybe get into a position where they can kind of make the top tier of tournaments. I think we should look at it, I mean, the way I was looking at it, and you can always obviously let me know your own thoughts, is if we look at the 500s as something that we shouldn't expect to see the top players at too often, then I think the scheduling, it's still got some issues. I still spoke of the January tournaments, the way the order of it is a bit off, and I still think Super 1000 should be on their own, and 2 750s is okay, but sometimes it does spill over. There's still some other issues, but I think when people look at it, like say I've looked at these 4 tournaments, and you're like, wow, Super 500. I'm still seeing a Super 500 because I hear the equivalent of Super Series is such a high level of tournament, and some 500s will be really, really strong. For sure, certain, especially like the Arctic Open was a pretty strong 500. But I think if we should lower our expectations and see that the level of the high-low Open, maybe a bit above that would be what a 500 should be. And then if we look at through that, the scheduling is still busy, but maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it offers more opportunities for players to play tournaments, more opportunities for players to earn prize money, to get exposure. Now, obviously, in 2 years' time, we're going to get much more TV coverage of these tournaments. Lots of things. So if we see it from the player's perspective, it's quite a good thing. Now, I know some of you are going to go, but what about the committed players, Ben? Yes, the committed players, I think if you're like top 10 or 15, you have to play all the 1000s, all the 750s, and you have to play 2 500s. And I've criticised that in the past, but now when I think about it, 2 500s, there's 9 in the year. That's not too bad. You're probably going to get top players. There's going to be one for them that's going to be in their country. So Indonesia has one because they had the Indonesia Open and the Indonesia Masters. Malaysia has the Malaysia Masters. Is that a 500? I'm pretty sure it would be a 500, etc. So that even if it's within their country or it's very close to, or like I said, like the Arctic Open, it's going to be that one before a bigger tournament. So players are likely, top players might play it as a kind of warm-up event. You know, we look at I know it's not a 500, but the German Open before the All England. Quite a lot of players do travel to that because they want a weaker competition before they go to the All England. So I'm not sure if I'm going round in circles here, but I initially, when I was thinking of these tournaments, I was like, Jesus, 4 tournaments of Super 500, super in my mind again, Super Series. That's a really crazy schedule. Badminton fatigue, etc., etc. But then when I thought about it as a opportunities for players, and that 500s maybe shouldn't be seen in such a highlight, that maybe it's more opportunities for the kind of players that I'm going to talk about a little later in this video. And like I said, with committed players, they don't have to play. They don't have to play 2 of the 9 500s, and I think within their year that's not too bad. I also think, and I've said this before, is that I think it's going to come down to, yes, I said scheduling. There's definitely some things that can be improved upon, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts on that. But I think a lot of it, we need to also look at the players and the coaching teams, especially, and how they plan out the year. If I use one relatively good example, although maybe not so in from what I've recently heard, but Alex Lanier, he's young, obviously been doing really well. He's in the top 10 in the world in the men's singles. But he's been very selective with his tournaments. There's been certain tournaments where I'm like, why isn't he playing? Because he's young. If you consider like the Popovs, they were going around to absolutely every tournament when they were that age, in the 19, 20 years old kind of bracket, trying to gain as much experience. Whereas Lanier's been very selective. I think almost too much, because I think he's actually not playing Australia or Kumamoto, even though if he played it, he could have a really good chance of qualifying for the World Tour finals. But maybe they're looking beyond that. They're looking really into the future for his development. So again, maybe it's going to come down to coaching and that stuff. Again, seeing the 500s for what they are and picking very selective ones. We're talking, if you're a top 10 player, you have to play 2. But even if you're not, even if you're a 10 to 20 player and you're just outside that committed bracket, maybe still only playing 1 to 2, not doing a Cho Chien Chen and playing every tournament under the sun. So maybe there's a little bit of onto the players. But again, I don't want to get away from the fact that I do think the scheduling, it's a very busy schedule. But then a lot of sports are busy. If we look at, I don't follow that many other sports, but I know the tennis season is really hard. Basketball, obviously, I know they have an off season, but the on season is incredibly difficult. We're talking like 2 or 3 big games every week. That's obviously really tough. Badminton players don't quite have that. I think it's going to come down to, BWF are definitely going to have to kind of figure a few things out, maybe the order of stuff. Maybe we as fans need to see 500s in a slightly different light, then it would actually make the schedule not look as mental as it does. And then I think the players and the coaches need to really focus more on how they approach. Again, another example is we see the Korean team, An Seong, Kim Won-ho and Seo Sun-jae. They only played the 750s. They turned up, they did their job, and then they're done. There's no need to play the 500s anymore. I obviously both those are going to have to play 2, but they'll probably play like the Korean Open, and they'll probably go. I think they're going to Kumamoto, one of those ones, and the Australian to kind of tick that box because it's not too far for them. So obviously before we had seen probably An Seong play 4, maybe 5 Super 500s. Now she's going to play the bare minimum of 2, and that's obviously a good thing. So Again, I would end this by just saying I'd love to hear your thoughts on the schedule. I know it's crazy, but maybe we can see it through the light, like I said, I'm repeating myself a few times here, but of opportunities for players. We can't just see it through the lens of the very, very best. There's obviously a whole tier of systems to this, to badminton, and maybe we should lower our thoughts on what a Super 500 actually is. Let me know your thoughts, guys. I'm going to move on because, like I said,